Everybody, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today to learn about our department and our grant funding process. My name is Teva Arapari. I'm the administrative analyst on the fiscal team with community development. Our agenda today is to introduce the community development department, provide an overview of the neighborhood investment plan and its outcomes, define eligible activities that are approved for grant funding, and discuss the application timeline. We're also going to provide some information to assist organizations in getting ready for funding and provide some tips and suggestions to consider when you're preparing your applications. Hopefully by the time we finish this presentation, you'll know more about the programs and feel more prepared to decide whether to apply for our funding. The slides for this presentation will be provided at the end of the session, and information is also available online through the community development website under grant and funding. Okay. So getting into it, we're represented from the community development department. Community development consists of two primary functions, grants management and housing rehabilitation. Community development partners with community organizations to meet identified housing and community development needs. Grant funding to meet these needs comes from CDBG, HOME, ESG, JAG, Home Investment Partnerships, American Rescue Plan, so HOME ARP, and other state, federal, and local grants. Our second function, housing rehabilitation, focuses on homeownership rehabilitation and lead hazard control programs for residential properties within the city of Grand Rapids. So what is the Neighborhood Investment Plan? So the Neighborhood Investment Plan is the city's grant investment plan for housing and community development activities. As mentioned earlier, forgot to mention it before, but the needs are identified in the Regional 5-Year Housing and Community Development Plan. Funds to execute the city's neighborhood investment plan are appropriated or awarded by Congress annually. And the amounts below are estimates based on prior year awards. So we're hopeful to get close to those midway through the funding process. Right now, our estimates for CDBG are $5 million, from HOME $1.5 million, ESG $320,000, and we're estimating $144,000 funding from JAG. Funding applications also are open annually in preparation for our annual action plans. All right. This year, our neighborhood investment plan consists of 8 priority outcomes. The outcomes are outlined in our 5-year plan and stay the same through the 5-year period. Fiscal year 2025 is the 4th year of the plan. So outcome 1, prevent and resolve episodes of homelessness. 2, improve access and stability to affordable housing. 3, increase supply of affordable housing. 4, improve the condition of existing housing. 5, foster engaged, connected, and resilient neighborhoods. 6, improve community safety. 7, improve economic opportunity. And 8, enhance neighborhood infrastructure. At this point, does anybody have any questions or anything before we move forward? Take that as a no. Okay, I'm going to pass it over to Tammy to continue.
Hi, everybody. My name is Tammy Vincent. I'm the homelessness coordinator with the Community Development Department in the City of Grand Rapids. I'm going to go through the next couple of slides for us. So here we have a list of some of the eligible activities that these funding sources can fund. You see 3 here. I think it's important also to note that this is not an exhaustive list of the activities that we're able to fund. So the first one, housing. A couple examples include affordable housing development and home ownership opportunities, home repair and access modifications, homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing. We also have public services, as an eligible activity. This includes public safety or violence reduction, community organizing and education or training, fair housing, legal services and housing counseling, job training, skills development, and micro enterprise assistance, childcare, medical or mental health, and transportation services. Infrastructure is another option. Improvements to this includes improvements to public parks, playgrounds, and streets, planting trees in public spaces or parkways or rights of way, physical improvements to public facilities and spaces, and building facade improvements. The funds also have a required benefit aspect. They must benefit low and moderate income people or neighborhoods. So here we have 3 different types of benefit options. For the first one is an area-wide benefit based on low to moderate income eligible neighborhood. The next is an individual benefit. This is based on household income. So some examples are a 1-person household income that falls below $50,150 annually, or perhaps a 4-person household income that falls below $71,600 annually. And the third type of benefit is a presumed LMI benefit. This applies to certain categories of households. That includes elderly, homeless, severely disabled, and there are others. All right, so a little bit more detail about the required benefit. So is this project area or individual benefit? If it's an area benefit, this serves a neighborhood or a specific geographic area. The project is not limited to serving only those of a certain group. For example, some of the groups we just discussed, seniors, youth, or those experiencing homelessness. Also, in an area benefit, all residents in that area benefit from the activity. If it's an individual benefit, the project serves individuals or households based on their income. The project may serve special populations, and the number of project beneficiaries or participants can easily be quantified. So how is the LMI benefit documented? For an area benefit, income of the residents of the neighborhood must on average be less than 51% LMI. The city uses HUD data to evaluates HUD data to determine this. And then for an individual benefit, the subrecipient maintains income documentation for each person or household that they serve. Ways that you can get that documentation are check stubs or tax returns. So a little bit about the neighborhood investment plan process. The first step is the NOI, or the notice of intent to apply application. So each organization submits only one NOI. The NOI is used for the following purposes. It assesses the organization's capacity to receive the funds and carry out the project. It affirms the proposed project will achieve one of the 8 previously discussed outcomes. It ensures the proposed project meets requirements. And applications are initially reviewed by city staff. They're then reviewed by a subcommittee made up of city commissioners. Invited applicants will then submit a full RFP, or request for proposal application, for the selected projects. So in step 2, we have the RFP application. Organizations complete an application for each invited project. So if an organization within their NOI proposed more than one project and more than one project is invited for an RFP, multiple RFPs would be submitted, one for each project. There are different versions for different types of projects. This has the same review process as the NOI. It results in funding recommendations. One exception is that the applications for outcome 1, which are applications for preventing or resolving episodes of homelessness, these are also reviewed by the Kent County Continuum of Care. And then recommendations are distributed to the applicants, they're made public, and publicly presented to the full city commission. Important to note that continued funding is not guaranteed, and previously funded projects must reapply each year. Okay, so here's a little bit about the timeline for the neighborhood investment plan process. Now we're in September of 2023, we're holding our informational sessions. In December, We anticipate the application timeline will be released in January of 2024. The notice of intent to apply will be both released and, excuse me, released and due. And in February of 2024, the RFP is released to selected applicants and then also due. March of 2024, funding recommendations will be presented to City Commission. April of 2024, City Commission public hearing on the recommendations. And in April 2024, there's a 30-day public comment period that will come to an end. May 2024, City Commission approval of funding and the annual action plan. And then again, please note the timeline is subject to change. So that's all from me today. From here, I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Joanna.
Okay, hi everybody. My name is Joanna Schulte. I'm an admin analyst too here in the Community Development Department. So if you were to be funded, we have kind of an outline of the annual process. So funding would get approved in, like Tammy said, it would be May of 2024. And then we would start the pre-agreement certification process. And that's kind of a big collection of a bunch of different documents to verify your organization's eligibility to receive funding. And then once we complete that, we route the agreement for signature. It gets routed electronically. And then we start issuing payment requests and performance reports on July 1, typically. Construction projects are a little different. They kind of exist on a different timeline. But for most of our social service kinds of organizations, we're starting July 1 to June 30. So for FY 2025, agreements would start July 1 of 2024 through June 30 of 2025. Payment requests and performance reports get submitted typically monthly, sometimes quarterly on the performance side. And then we can do budget modifications throughout the year. We try to limit those. You want to make sure that your budget's in line with actuals on a regular basis, so we're not having to reevaluate the budget every month. But we can do those as time goes on. And then we conduct monitoring visits, sometimes before and sometimes after the closeout of the agreement. We would come out on site and go through a variety of different questions to verify compliance with all of the rules and regulations. We provide that checklist in advance of the monitoring visit and try to give lots of opportunity to answer questions as we go throughout the year. One of the things that we do try to do with new organizations or new projects is to come out and have conversations about requirements, like a technical assistance visit or just a virtual call to discuss the program and the requirements as you get started in the beginning of the year. That way we can work out any issues or there's no surprises at a monitoring visit. So that's kind of what the year looks like. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the generally applicable requirements of the funding we receive. As Tava had mentioned, the vast majority of our grant funding comes from the federal government. So we're required to apply all of these requirements for all the programs we fund. But we want to give you as much information as we can in advance so you can evaluate whether the funding is a good fit for your program or organization. So we can only fund organizations that are legally established qualifying entities. Typically on the non-construction side, that means you're a fully operational 501c3. Sometimes on the construction side, you can not be a nonprofit organization, but that's typically true of our social service organizations and programs. And then we have to check to make sure that you're not debarred or excluded from the receipt of federal funding. In order to do that, you have to have a full registration at sam.gov. And we have instructions on completing that registration as well. That's something that can be done during our pre-agreement process. But if you're an organization that expects to receive funding or you want to get started on that a little earlier, maybe you are looking into applying for other federal grant funds, that may be something you choose to do sooner rather than later. It can take a bit of time to get the registration fully complete based on our experience. So that has to get done at sam.gov and you have to do a full registration. There's like a partial version and a full version. You'd want to do the full version. And then we look for organizations that have some demonstrated experience with the proposed activities. You wouldn't want it to be kind of your first project ever necessarily, depending on the complexity of the program. There can be a lot of requirements that are tied to the federal funding. And then we need to keep documentation of all expenses as well as performance and other things related to the grant for about 4 to 5 years, depending on the funding source. So that's something to keep in mind ahead of time. We operate on a reimbursement basis, so all the money that we receive from the city would have to have been spent first by you and documented, and you'd have to keep receipts for about 4 to 5 years. And then you're going to document and report on the performance outcomes as outlined in your contract every quarter at least. And then if you're a program that provides those direct services like Tammy was talking about, an individual benefit program would be required to document participant household income. So you would typically have like client files with some like a verified address, documentation of the household tax return or 2 months of check stubs, something like that. Your organization has to have general liability insurance. We could get into the kind of details of that. Typically, we work that out in the pre-agreement process, but just so you're aware of the requirements, your organization has to have at least $1 million of general liability insurance, and then some auto insurance as well. And it has to be up to date and list the city as additionally insured. So sometimes that's something folks have to follow up on once they receive our funding to amend their insurance to meet requirements. And then your organization, at least as it applies to the program that we're funding, although it's not a bad idea to do it anyway, has to conduct open and competitive hiring processes. We have to properly classify workers as either employees or contractors. We have more information and guidance around how to do that. But in general, you want to make sure that people you're treating as employees are compensated as employees, and you're withholding their taxes and have them on payroll, and not just giving them a 1099, say. And then your organization would have to have policies related to conflicts of interest, procurement, so how you do, in what cases and how you do bids and quotes for different goods and services. In general, you have to do that for higher priced goods or services. So you have to have a policy about that. You have to have a policy about how long you're going to retain records related to our contract, and then handle any consumer or resident complaints about your program and kind of how it gets escalated and where those complaints or concerns get forwarded. A few more requirements to talk about. Programs that we fund have to maintain at least 6 weeks of non-restricted funding. That's to maintain cash flow for our program. Because we operate entirely on a reimbursement basis, your organization has to have at least 6 weeks of funding in order to pay out your payroll, get your operating costs covered for the month. And that's something you want to keep a good eye on when you're considering how much funding to request from the city. Say your organization has maybe $10,000 in your general fund bank account. You couldn't then request $1 million of funding from the city because in theory, 6 weeks of $1 million project, I have to do math that I don't know if I can do that quickly. Divided by 52 times 6. To get $1 million, you would need like a good $100,000 in your bank account. That's to cover your cash flow for the program. So that's just something to think about. And we can always assist if folks want to have more conversation about that. And then you need to maintain time records for all your staff that are compensated by the grant. So they have to have timesheets that show how much time they spent on the grant versus your other funding sources, so you know how much to request for reimbursement. You would need an accounting and financial system that can separate your revenue and expenses by different codes or classes, by funding source or project. So if we fund you for one project A and project B, you would need to be able to track all of your expenses on any of your other programs and funding sources, but also our programs and sources separately. You need to be able to segregate financial duties. That means you have checks and balances in place. So when you're processing payments, there's multiple people kind of looking at signing off on things and recording them in your financial system. You have to document your methods for allocating shared costs, like your utility bills or any other potential shared costs you might have. You want to have strong financial oversight and internal controls, like I mentioned, and staff or contracted attorneys who understand all of the generally accepted accounting principles and federal grant requirements. And then we look at things at a monitoring visit. Those would include like receipts, documentation of performance, any client files and required documentation, and then anything else that might pertain to the program and compliance under the regulations. And like I said, we try to work with folks to make sure that you have all of that information up front. But I do like to prepare people that if issues are identified in a monitoring visit, they may require corrective actions, which sometimes is change your policy or your practice or something like that. And in some cases, it can be repayment of funds. So you have to kind of think about that as you're considering whether to apply. You might want to think about, are we in a good place to be able to handle the complexity of the requirements, or do we have a little bit more administrative capacity building to do first? Because you certainly wouldn't want to risk having to repay funds if you weren't ready to receive the funding. I always feel like I'm the bearer of bad news on that slide. So I think that this section gets a little more positive. These are tips and things to think about before applying. So these are questions you'll want to ask yourself or your organization as you're preparing to apply or consider applying. So one of the things you want to consider is our organization prepared to comply with all of these requirements? Does our board and our staff understand all of these requirements? Do we want to have a little bit more conversation with the city? I will include in the chat by the end of the call contact information for our department. So if you're interested in having more conversation about the details of the requirements as they pertain to the grants, or if you want to have conversation about a particular proposed project, you would want to start having that conversation with us sooner rather than later. Once we kick off the funding process in January, we're not as able to really respond to those kind of bigger questions. At that point, we're really only helping with technical assistance to access the application, but we're not having as much conversation about your project in particular, just to be fair to all the other applicants. So if you're interested in applying, but you want to have more conversation about whether our funding is a good fit, please reach out to us and we'd be happy to schedule some time to have that conversation. So that's my big caveat. But you'll also want to consider whether your organization has the capacity, the experience, the staffing, the systems to kind of fulfill these requirements. Do you have the funding and any applicable, or does the funding, our funding, and any applicable requirements align with your organization's mission and values? This is an important question. Sometimes we've had folks apply for our funding, be awarded funding, and then realize that maybe the income documentation requirements for their participants just doesn't really align with the program or their relationship with clients, your organization's mission. And we understand that the funding isn't going to be the perfect fit for every program or organization. We just want to make sure that we're equipping you with all of the information you need to determine that ahead of time. And then you'll consider if you're planning to apply in partnership with some other entity, you'll want to think about who's going to be the applicant, or sometimes people will use the word like fiduciary. The city is going to contract with whatever entity is receiving the funding. So you would want to have conversations with those other entities. If you're partnering with a nonprofit, think about who's going to apply, who's going to receive the funding. And we'd be happy to have those conversations with you uh, before the end of the calendar year if you're interested in doing that. And then which staff are going to be involved in the project, and think about how the grant might impact your organizational budgeting and cash flow, because of that reimbursement basis, you'll want to think about, do we have the cash flow to manage the proposed project? What's the scale at which we could do this project or not do the project? So be thinking about all of those kinds of questions. And then I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Ben.
All right, thank you, Joanna. My name is Ben Grostic, contract administrator here with the city. I mainly work with construction-related projects. You'll be happy to know we have only 5 more slides, so we are almost there. So you made it this far, just stay with us a little bit longer. So for some key internal questions, Joanna just did that. I'm going to keep going. Yes, is my project eligible? So going back to what Teva listed at the beginning, you have to fit one of the 8 neighborhood investment plan outcomes. They're pretty clear, and it needs to fit one of those. If you have questions or if you're not sure what one it would fall under, you can let us know and we'll be happy to talk to you about that in advance. The projects do need to serve low to moderate income people or neighborhoods, as Tammy mentioned. Participant household income documents and demographic information must be obtained and retained as it applies. Outcomes of the project must be quantifiable, tracked, documented, and reported. It's important to save all that information and track it. You're going to have to track it in order to do your quarterly reports, but you need to save it then, of course. And then are there components of the project that are generally ineligible? So we cannot do gift cards or stipends, things like that, cash payments. Costs associated with food, alcohol, fundraising, or entertainment are not allowed with federal funds. Even if you're doing a fundraising event, you can't buy, snacks or you can't do that with our funding. Political activities and lobbying are not allowed. And then improvements to private property owned by the organization are not eligible activities. And we cannot do improvements to city-owned property either. In terms of how much you should request, think about that very carefully, of course. How much do you really need to make the project successful? How much is needed for the staff and for the grant activities? What is your organization's balance and unrestricted funding? I mean, make sure you have the 6-week requirement, 6 weeks of unrestricted funding. And then can other funding be secured, and how much is it? We can't award you more than you've asked for, but we can certainly offer less than what you've asked for. And then at that point, you can determine whether it's possible to scale back your project or program to accept less or to keep it the same and backfill with other funding. But we cannot award more than asked for. But think about what you need and what's reasonable. You can also talk to us about what you're thinking, and you can also look on our website at past years' annual action plans to see what other organizations have been awarded for doing similar activities. That's a good way to kind of think about what is commonly awarded for like projects. Yeah, so there we go. Application tips. Please start it early and submit before the deadline. There's always somebody or a couple organizations that are dealing with it the day of the deadline and are emailing and can't do something or have technical difficulty. Try to do it sooner rather than later, because then we can be more helpful if you have issues. Please read all the instructions carefully before starting. This goes for the NOI and the RFPs. The application should clearly convey your community need for the project and the benefit to low to moderate income residents. Your measurable outcomes, whether the project will be an expansion of existing program or whether it's a new program or project, and what the grant funding will be used for. For instance, operational costs versus staff costs. Answer the questions concisely, avoid organization or industry specific terms. Ensure responses address the question that is asked and don't include ineligible expenses. And also, this is kind of important, please don't tailor to a specific funding source. What we will do is based on what you're proposing, we will think about what federal sources could fund it. For instance, there are some things that could be funded by both home and CDBG, or CDBG and ESG, and we will kind of move things if it's an eligible activity and something that through our NOI process we think we want an RFP for. We're going to consider what bucket it should go into. So you don't really need to think about that. We prefer for organizations to be open-minded about receiving whatever funds we could possibly provide. Of course, there are activities that are very specific and are clearly going to be from one bucket. Construction is a good example for building multi-unit rental. It's almost always going to be home, though in some cases CDBG could be used for at least rehabilitation. So just be aware of that. Make sure attachments have clear names and ensure they're properly uploaded. And then this isn't on the slide, but be very careful with copying and pasting. Sometimes people will copy things from mission statements or other parts of their website and paste it in, and quite frankly, they won't proofread it, and it doesn't make sense, and it's just a lot of language that's really not relevant to the question. Please don't just fill the boxes with meaningless text. Make sure you read through it, have multiple people read through it, and so we can have a really concise, clear, and well-written application that will help us out, and it will ultimately help you. We'll be more, I think everyone involved will be more inclined to look favorably on your project if it's well written than if it's really poorly written. And that's not a guarantee of funding, but it's something to consider. For housing development, these are very different in a lot of ways once they are funded. For strong applications, we're looking for evidence of financial viability and that you've secured other funding. It's very important that your primary source of funding has been secured. So if it's a LIHTC project, we would want to see that you already have LIHTC. There are some exceptions, but for most projects, you should have your primary funding source secured already. The timeline needs to be realistic. If we issue an award in May or June, we're generally going to expect that you can get under contract with the city by the end of December of the same year. It doesn't mean the project has to break ground, but we're looking for 6 months and getting under contract. And so that's a pretty fast-moving timeline there. The sites need to be identified, or at least for single-family homes, they can be a little looser, but you should have sites identified. You should have experience with housing development. If your organization does not have experience, then you should have really key partners that are going to walk alongside you, and there should be evidence of that. Otherwise, your application is not very strong and is less likely to be funded. Community engagement efforts should be outlined, and the results of those efforts should be in your application. You must, of course, be in compliance with city's master plan and zoning ordinance. And don't forget, no choice limiting actions can take place from the time funding is awarded, or basically when you're applying for funding, you shouldn't take choice limiting actions until later if you've been awarded and we've done the environmental review process. If you already own land that you're going to build on, for instance, and it's already been purchased, that's fine. That's not a choice limiting action. But basically, once you engage with the city to request home funding, for instance, or CDBG funding in some cases, once you've engaged with the city and applied for funds, then you should not be taking choice limiting actions. And that would include contracts, land acquisition, actual construction, anything that is for sure. And an option agreement for land is okay if it allows you to get out of the agreement if you were not funded, or if the environmental review process did not go through. So those are some key things. If you have other questions about housing, definitely contact me because it is a little bit different than some of our other projects. All right, we're happy to take questions. There's also our web address on the bottom there. We have some new material on the website that kind of summarizes a lot of aspects of this presentation, and in some ways more concisely. So feel free to visit that and look through the website for more material. With that, we can open it up for questions. If you want to come off your microphone, mute, and verbally ask us, that's fine, or otherwise you can put it in the chat. And if you have no questions at all and you need to get going, that is fine as well. We thank you for participating.
I think participants have the ability to come off mute. But
If
feel
you
free to throw
don't,
in
let
the
us
chat
know.
if I'm
Yeah.
wrong.
Yeah.
We're kind of experimenting with the webinar format, so we were hoping that it works well for folks. In general, I think you just want to think about, does the funding work well for us? Are we willing to kind of follow all of these requirements, and is it a good fit? And then as you're working on your application, be thinking about being concise, giving a good explanation of your program and what you're trying to do, and the kind of costs involved. I see Annette has her hand up. Feel free to come off mute if you can.
I was getting ready to start typing crazy. Anyways, we have had other organizations reach out to us in the past who are new to, because they got their new 501c3. They're trying to, other neighborhood groups, they're trying to like get going again. They've been gone for a while. Now they're coming back online as a new 501c3. Got brand new 501c3 numbers and all that fun stuff. If they come to us and say, hey, can you help us? Are you going to be all right with that? And if they name us as their partners, I mean, we're not going to charge them for helping them. We're just going to do it. But
I think that you'll want to be clear about what the nature of the relationship is for the purposes of the the grant funding. So you'll want to figure out, are we sharing some portion of the funding? Are we just providing, some sort of technical assistance or pre-application assistance versus maybe post-award assistance? You'll just want to have some dialogue about what that looks like between the two organizations. I mean, we would be happy to help kind of have that conversation in advance of the funding process too, if they're open to it. But by the time that the application gets submitted, you just want to have some clarity around what is the nature of that relationship if they're going to explain it in the application.
so it would be good then to have like a clear memorandum of understanding, even if money's not changing hands.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to be necessarily like a legal MOU at that point.
But just some sort of like expectations kind of thing.
Yeah. Like,
So nobody gets mad at anybody.
That's always a good plan.
Just curious, because I know the question was already raised when we went out and did our neighborhood retreat last week. So they're like, when funding comes up, because it's coming up, because they sent out the thing, I'm like, yes, please make sure you attend that. And if you need any other help, obviously we're going to help you all because we're neighborhood people. We want all neighborhood people to be able to participate. So
yeah, and we would be happy to have those any preliminary discussions with folks as well. The areas, so the neighborhood association funding is a low mod area benefit program. So we have to make sure that the area in question meets those income requirements. That's one of the things that we talk about. And then, just making sure that the organization is positioned well to receive the funding would be a conversation we're happy to kind of sort out in advance too.
yeah, so just if the newer neighborhood orgs, I mean, we've put it out to them before, but the new ones are people that have new people in place and they want help and maybe you're not able to help them. We are finally in a position where we have the capacity to help others. So
yeah, that's great. And I will say our community development staff try to stay pretty neutral in the funding process. And so, we're not ultimately making decisions about the funding. That's the city commission, the subcommittee, and the full commission make the final funding decisions. So in advance of the funding process, if you're looking to just kind of get an idea of what the requirements look like, get an idea of what your project, whether it's a good fit or not, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to have those conversations, and it's not going to, change anything about how your application is viewed at the time that it is submitted, but hopefully will help provide a little context around what you should be thinking about at this stage.
I just know that I don't necessarily see them on this call, and I don't know if they're going to be on the call tomorrow. So if they come to me, I know what the answer is supposed to be. So thank you for answering that question.
Yeah, no problem. We did have a question in the chat about whether the neighborhood investment plan applies to neighborhood associations. It does. So if I go, I'm going to take control from Ben if he lets me. Okay. If I go back to the neighborhood investment plan outcomes, outcome 5 is related to fostering engaged and connected resilient neighborhoods. That would typically include, or it does include, the neighborhood leadership and civic engagement projects we do in partnership with neighborhood associations. And then outcome 6 is about improving community safety. And that is the outcome area that the neighborhood association public safety projects fall under. It's worth noting, just as a kind of general headline, we don't fund organizations, we fund projects that provide some sort of public good in the community, especially for those low mod income residents. So neighborhood association projects meet those one or two or both of those outcome areas. Okay, and then so outcome 3 would be the one for affordable housing development projects. So all of those things are true. We fund a variety of different programs and projects underneath all of these different outcomes. And you can find more information at our website. I'll put in our just general department page as well in the chat if you are interested in checking it out. We have reports and plans that outline all of the projects we funded in the last few years, and all of the reports on accomplishments for those programs. You can find that under reports and plans on our website. I see another, Janine has a question. Go ahead and come off mute if you can.
Yes, thank you. So can you clarify, is it the project that needs to have 6 weeks of funding under unrestricted, or the organization?
The organization needs to have at least that much in some sort of non-restricted bucket at any given time. So it doesn't have to be like at least for a social service project. The construction stuff is a little different, so I'm going to set that aside. But for our non-construction programs, you need to have, it doesn't have to be like a project specific set aside, but you do as an organization need to have at least that much in non-restricted funding. So it kind of is a guidepost for how much your organization is able to apply for a given project. You know, like I said earlier, you can look at how much you got now and figure out what's the most we could get from the city. Or you can do the calculation backwards and just figure out what's 6 weeks of the amount that we're requesting for the year. And do we have that much available to kind of make sure that we have sufficient cash flow? Hope that answers the question.
I'll add as well that we prefer that projects we fund have additional funding besides the city. I mean, it depends a lot on the type of project you're doing, but we like it when there are multiple funding sources. And then if you have other funding sources, that often will take care of, or could take care of your 6-week issue, depending on what the source is, right? If it's a foundation source, you might have the money up front or something like that. So that obviously helps if you're not relying only on one source.
Thanks, that helps. And then to piggyback off of that question, the reimbursement process, I think I might have missed the very beginning where you talked about this is reimbursement funding. Can you clarify on that?
Yeah, so all of the funding that we provide is issued on a reimbursement basis. I don't know exactly what slide I have those words on, truthfully. Probably back here somewhere.
Yeah, so basically you spend the money first, and then you send us a payment request with applicable documentation, and then we reimburse you for the money you spent, more or less.
And that funding is for the costs associated with providing the projects that you applied for. So we don't cover costs that aren't associated with the costs for
You'll have
making
a
the
budget,
project
yeah,
operational. We reimburse you for the costs that you can associate and document with the work that's done for the project.
When we say the project, a funded project will have a budget that has approved line items, right? So if a whole project costs 100 grand and you're getting 30 grand from the city, you don't necessarily have to, you could in many cases decide what eligible costs you want to be reimbursed from the city, and those are the costs that are going to go in your budget. So maybe staff costs are eligible and program expenses are eligible as well, and you could decide to use the city funding for one or the other, or focus more on one or the other to have fewer line items in your budget, and then you'd only be reimbursed for those eligible costs that have been put in your budget. That makes sense.
And Ben is kind of outlining a strategy that is sometimes smart for organizations that don't have as much capacity at the time that they're applying. If you apply for funds for only like certain costs, maybe it's maybe you just want to apply for the staff time associated with doing the project, then the only cost that you're having to document and then show us at a monitoring visit and keep up with and get reimbursed for are just those personnel costs, as opposed to spreading out the grant over all of the possible attributed costs that could be shared among this project and all your other organizations' funding sources. That's a little bit sometimes more sophisticated to execute. So if you have concerns about your financial capacity to associate the cost properly, one way to mitigate some risk is to just focus on costs that are a little bit easier to document and that you can keep track of well. That's also something we're happy to kind of get in the weeds on with you if you want to sit down with us and talk about a potential project or what kind of costs you might apply for. We're happy to do that as well. I know there was a question in the chat about if a project is an area benefit project, do you need to document household income? The answer is no, but I will say that there are a lot of projects that end up falling into the individual benefit category. So one of the things that determines whether a project is going to be an area benefit or individual benefit is whether the project serves all of the residents of a given small targeted area. So if that is true, it's more likely to be an area benefit project. So maybe that's, we're opening a community center that just serves the residents of this area, and we want to provide staffing to provide a particular service to those residents. That possibly is an area benefit. But any of the projects that are serving individual or households, any special populations, like we're only going to serve seniors, only going to serve youth, only going to serve people experiencing homelessness, or a project that's serving the entire city or residents of the entire city potentially are going to be individual benefit programs. If you have a potential project out there that you're like, we're mulling this over, trying to figure out which one it might be, we'd be happy to kind of chat with you about that as well and help you figure out what it would look like under our funding. But yes, the area benefit projects, we document income by looking at the residents of a target area. And I think I saw another hand. Let me get back to where the names were. Dee Dee?
Yes, hi. I just had a question that kind of piggyback of what you have already been talking about. The first question is, how long is that reimbursement timeline, if you know?
Sure. Yeah, so a lot of projects, especially new ones, submit monthly reimbursement requests. So you start in the month of July, you do all of the work, perform the services, and then look at what costs were attributed to our program. And then you typically like pull a financial report from your financial system that tells you how much to request for reimbursement. And it's for all of those expenses that you've already actually paid. And then we receive your reimbursement request. It's due by the 15th of the following month. And then we're pretty quick about approving them. They typically get approved within, I mean, I think technically we give it 30 days, but we generally approve them within a week or two. And then the checks get cut and mailed, although for anybody who currently receives funds, I think there may be a process now where you can sign up for direct deposit. So if you want information about that, reach out to your contract administrator, who might have to reach out to our financial people, but it's kind of a new thing. If we can get that underway, that should speed things up as well. But it can typically take between 4 to 6 weeks to receive the check after the month has ended. That's kind of why we expect you to have some cash flow in place to keep the lights on and keep your staff paid while you're waiting for that reimbursement check.
Absolutely. And lastly, are all of the city grants based off a reimbursement schedule?
All of the grants that are funded through this funding process in our department are.
Okay.
The city, like the broader city that includes all the other departments may have some other grant opportunities as well. I know our economic development folks, sometimes there's some grants available out of our equity office. The neighborhood match fund is, I think, what I'm thinking of there. So there are sometimes other opportunities to receive funds from other departments that are not necessarily gonna have to apply all of these same requirements, but our department's annual funding process is all of our federal funding. So it comes with all those strings attached.
Okay, very good to know. Thank you.
Welcome.
And I would mention housing construction being very different. We do a reimbursement basis as well, but it can be paid or payable. So for some big, really expensive housing projects, they'll have invoices and lien waivers, and then they'll send us all that with a sworn statement, and then we can pay, and they haven't technically paid the general contractor yet. The invoice is payable. It's a little different just because of the nature of construction and how costly it is. But
Thanks, Ben. That's a good caveat. Any other questions? Well, I really appreciate everybody's time today. We're excited to hear about new projects and what everybody's got going on, even current projects and how they're going. And we're always happy to sit down with folks and work out how your program or project might be a good fit, if it's a good fit for our programs. And if you would like any more information, feel free to reach out to us. I did put, if you scroll back up to the top of the chat, I'm going to copy it again, just so it's at the bottom. I did throw out a link to a survey to let us know if the information today was helpful, or if there's anything else that we could add in future presentations. We would be happy to hear that. So there's an anonymous survey link and more information on our website. You'll also be hearing from me via email with slides and probably all the information I put in the chat as well. But I really appreciate everyone's time today, and hope to hear soon.